Maxamed Abu-Maye, Dr. Abu-Maye, thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I appreciate it. So you are assistant professor at the Ohio State University.
That is correct.
How long you were there?
This is my third year.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
so I got hired in 2022.
How long you lived here in Ohio?
I actually partly grew up in Ohio.
Okay.
I lived in Capitol Park. I don't know if you're familiar with
Yeah, I am
Capitol
very
Park.
familiar with that.
Yeah, so I lived there. I lived there, and I went to Mifflin High School.
Okay.
And so I was living with my mother in Capitol Park for about 4 years, and then moved towards the end of sophomore year of high school to Illinois, Carroll Stream, Illinois, to stay with my father. So I have definite roots in Columbus, and most of my family is still here. My mother, my sisters. So it's Columbus is not new for me.
So from Africa to Columbus first, right?
No,
Yeah.
I actually, like many Somalis, and
Okay.
I had a very diverse migration path.
Okay.
So my family, in 1996, we were the first Somali family. We settled in Wheaton, Illinois.
Okay.
So we were the first Somalis in that neighborhood that were resettled there, one of the first waves in 1996.
Oh, wow. Yeah, we're not too much different. I came 1996, I think, or maybe 1997
Okay.
here. I mean, straight to Columbus.
Mhm. Okay,
Until
yeah.
then, I have lived here. So let's backtrack a little bit, right? In Somalia, when the Civil War started, how old were you?
I was really young, so as I mentioned to you a little bit earlier, I have an article coming out in the 𝐂�𝐿 Encyclopedia of Refugee Studies, which is an autoethnography of my experiences in the camp. And so the article, if anybody who's interested, is available. But I was.
Is it available now, or it will be?
It will be
coming out
available
soon?
a year from now.
Oh, a
but
year
it's,
from
it's,
now. Okay.
It's in an encyclopedia called Encyclopedia of Refugee Studies. So if you
Okay.
Google that, you'll see the article in there. But I was about 5 years old when the war started, so I have very few memories. I do have some memories, and I talk about that in the article. My family's journey to escape Somalia, and sort of some of the things that we had to do and experiences. I do have memories because I was old enough to remember
Okay.
some of the experiences. But yeah, I was about 5 when the war.
Do you remember how you get to Kenya?
Yeah, I remember bits and parts.
Okay.
I actually. To kind of bring into the work I want to do in Columbus. Part of the project that I want to do in Columbus is I want to do an oral history of the Somali community in Columbus, interview people about their experiences, how they fled the war, how they got to Columbus, digitize all of that,
Yeah.
and then make it accessible at the Ohio State University so younger generations can learn about their family history through this website. So that's so as part of that, I interviewed my parents about how they got out of Somalia, what their experiences were. Her experience was, we were living in Mogadishu, we were trapped in Mogadishu for a year before we could escape because of, as you might know, and there were so many checkpoints, and it was difficult to escape by foot. And so it took a year before we were able to make a really prolonged journey crossing the border to Kenya.
So fast forward all that, you came to Columbus and you lived in Capitol Park. I guess the question that I wanted to ask was like, taking the path you take now, what shaped that? What thoughts that came to mind in terms of like you, pursued an education, higher education per se?
Yeah, I mean, what really shaped that for me, and I talk about this in my research, is my experiences as a refugee, right? So I don't remember the war well, but I do remember the refugee camps. We were in the Dadaab refugee. We were in Taga first, and then Dadaab as well. So I was in refugee camps for about 5 years. So I spent much of my formative life, from the age of 5 to 10, in the refugee camps, and just the inequities and the injustices that I saw, right? So my mom, she tells, when we first arrived in the camps, they were not registering everyone on time, right? And there was such a mass influx of people, and we weren't able to get a tent or registration number for 3 months, right? And so it was a relative that allowed us to stay in her tent, an aunt of ours, and this is what allowed us to actually survive before we finally got registered and got a tent. And so for me, that experience really, instead of feeling sort of pity for refugees, it really showed the strength, the community resource, and the ingenuity of people who lost everything, but they rebuilt it, right? That, and then secondly, when I first came to America, we were resettled by the World Relief Organization, a Christian nonprofit organization, and we lived with a white family for about 2 months until we got our first apartment, and that was my first look at injustice, because I saw the kids had all these toys and all these resources, and we were living in a tent with no electricity or running water for 5 years, and that's when I first realized the world is an unequal place, and that's what kind of led to my journey of researching what was the war, what caused it, why were there refugees, what were the social, political situations that are not just specific to my family, but millions of Somalis. And that's what led to my interest in sort of higher education and studying sociology. But it really all began with my experience as a refugee. That's what propelled all my academic interest, and still what guides my goal of all my research is refugee first. How do we center refugee voices?
Interesting journey. At 5 years old, or maybe 6 to 7, coming to Dadaab, those were the early childhood education. Those are the years, right? So, and not having the basic and the foundation of education there early, how did you manage to catch up that fast when you come to the States?
This is the question I always ask myself, because I don't know if you remember your experiences, but when we were in the camps, there were no schools, even for children. There were volunteer teachers. Sometimes they were refugees themselves, and my memories were being in a tent with close to 50 people, everyone standing with one ma'alim teacher, and he's teaching us the alphabet, and you have 50-year-olds next to 6-year-olds all learning, right? And my earliest memory was winning the award for best student, right? But the education was wholly inadequate, right? Just learning ABC, alphabet. But what in hindsight really helped me, surprisingly, was Duksi, right? So my mother was very diligent, so I went to Duksi every day, and we were memorizing the Quran, right? And reciting it by heart, and we had these wooden boards.
It's called law.
So I remember it, and so that actually helped my thinking skills, right?
Gotcha.
Because all day I would come home to the tent and I would just be memorizing the Quran, and I think it definitely sparked, despite me being behind educationally, it spread up my brain. I became a really excellent reader. All I did was read every day the Quran in a language I didn't understand, right? Memorizing it. And so by the time we came to America at the age of 10, right, I didn't speak English, and we were put in ESL, but I think that my Duksi experience was actually a very useful educational experience in terms of I was to this day I'm a very fast reader. So it took me a while to realize, being behind educationally, how did I make it? The other kids had been going to school since they were 5. Right. And I didn't start until I was 10.
So you had a huge ground to cover for sure.
I was in ESL for about 3-4 years before I got lucky. There was a white teacher. She said, "You shouldn't be in ESL. You're far above your reading and writing levels," and she took me out of it. And as you might well know, being stuck in the ESL curriculum, for many young Somalis, you were getting an inadequate education.
Interesting journey, right? And you have an eye of trying to understand the refugee side of the Somalis, how it impacted, and it's not easy to uplift the whole family from one location to a whole new location. There's a host of things that can go wrong, and have already gone wrong. One of the things that I talk about is just the mental health side of it, right? So there is a huge mental health issue with our community, and I consider that that's a side effect of the civil war, or any civil war for that matter. But I kind of want to have an understanding. I understand the Somali refugees, the study that you really given it a huge interest on your side, but I want to know the African study and the African American study, and what led to that. What sparked you interested to kind of sort of go that route and understand a little bit more, a broader per se, on that side.
Yeah, I am a millennial Somali, right? So I am what immigration scholars call the 1.5 generation.
Okay.
So
Elaborate that.
So the 1.5 is in between. The first generation is the people who came to America as adults, the parents. The second generation are the Somalis born here. There's huge differences culturally, so on and so forth. The 1.5 is a unique generation, which is a group of Somalis who came to the United States as children. So unlike their parents, they're not necessarily as in tune to sort of their Somali culture. They grew up here, but unlike the ones born in America, right, they have memories of life back in Somalia. They're a little bit more attuned to their culture. It's the 1.5, the in-between. And I think that for me, millennials, there's many Somalis who came as children who are adults, and we are sort of the negotiators between the older and younger generation. The younger generation that's completely maybe detached from their culture.
Absolutely.
And so for us growing up, we had to what I call become black. So my mother, I'm not going to embarrass her, but like a lot of older Somalis, they didn't identify as black, right? They identified as Somali or their tribe, so on and so forth. But for those of us growing up here, I went to Mifflin High School, 90% predominantly black high school here in Columbus, right? Is that we understood, unlike our parents, that even if we did identify as Somali, the way the rest of the world treated us is how they treated all black people, right? So racial profiling, police stops, right? Being followed around in grocery stores and stores because you're black, they think you're a criminal. It led to my interest in are Somalis black? What does it mean to be black in America, right? And I'm not gonna, I've been studying this for 15 years as a scholar, so I'm not gonna get too theoretically dense, but it really came from lived experience, right? So, for young Somalis, millennials, growing up, we were wearing FUBU jerseys, Air Forces, right? In many ways following African American culture, right? Listening to hip hop, at the distress of our parents, right? Who are saying, don't lose your culture. And this is what many immigration scholars call assimilation, right? And so for African migrants, right, unlike other migrants, it's not becoming American is not assimilating to white culture. Oftentimes becoming American means assimilating into African American culture, because many African immigrants, where they're located, they oftentimes live in neighborhoods with a large African American community and population, right? And so it is there that I became interested in how are Somalis black, what does it mean to be black, and do Somalis experience anti-black racism in this country the way African American and other African migrants have done before them. So it's really my experiences with that, right, with experiencing racism myself, right, anti-black racism from police, from teachers, right, being followed around, people assume you're a criminal. I became really interested in that, and it became the basis partly for my book coming out called Black Muslim Refugee, Militarism, Policing, and Somali American Resistance to State Violence, right? I argue that Somali identity is at the intersection of three identities, which is being black, being Muslim, and being refugee, right? For many African Americans, they don't have necessarily the immigrant experience per se, and with the exception of African American converts, the Muslim experience, but Somalis, their identity is intersectional, right? You can't only be black, right, but also Muslim, refugee, and Somali as well, right? And so this sort of became the way I was interested in Somali identity, how is Somali identity changing, right, versus the way it used to be in the colonial era, right, during Italian colonialship and British colonial.
How do you think right now, after that many years, staying here in the United States or elsewhere, how do you think we view our identity right now?
Somali identity is unique depending on the country. So Somalis aren't only in America, right? Somalis are in Dubai, Somalis are in Kenya, but in America, there's a generational divide where younger Somalis, and more so particularly boys, and this is sort of research that's emerging, are identifying as black, are adopting sort of African American cultural values, styles of dress, whereas the older generation is identifying with their national identity, being Somali, or their tribal identity. And I think that is the direction for the future, where Somali identity is headed to is towards blackness and identifying as black, not as a negative connotation per se, right? So there's racist stereotypes about black people, but black as the way I like to call it, some scholars, the black radical tradition. That black history in America is black people resisting slavery, Jim Crow, police violence, and Somalis came into this context and understood that they had more to gain by being in solidarity with African Americans along shared struggles of mass incarceration, policing, state violence, which young Somalis, my generation, right, many of the kids I grew up with are in jail or in prison or unfairly locked up by the criminal justice system, and experience the same thing other black people do, which is being segregated to poor housing, underfunded housing, education and inequities, so on and so forth. So I think this is sort of the pattern for Somali immigrants that make them unique from other African immigrants, particularly the history of African immigrants from Nigeria and some of these other countries were more African elite, wealthy Africans who came to America for higher education, where Somalis were predominantly poor, came as refugees, didn't come with a lot of money. And so that's why Somali people amongst all African immigrants have the lowest education rates, the highest poverty rates. African immigrants are the most educated, with the exception of Somalis, and that's because of the structural conditions of war, colonialism, disaster, and also ongoing structural racism, right, with segregation happening in Columbus, right, in cities where Somalis are.
You're touching on good points, and no doubt about it, there's a huge disconnect. The kids that were born here, that
Yes.
grew up here on a very young age, right now that are maybe in 22, 23, and the parents that actually came here as struggling refugees trying to, trying to make it, not to their fault, and nobody's fault, but it just, I think, again, that I will lean back to, this is the side effect of what will do to you. So whenever that you've been relocated to a whole new city that you're not aware of, it's not, for one, there's a lack of the language. Two, lack of culture of understanding, and I think that's what the other Africans have an upper hand on, in per se, that they're they came here for education. They didn't come here to relocate. So I guess my question is, like, in your study, did you find ways that we can bridge the young minds that are already having a hard time here versus the old heads and the folks that came here that that pretty much were not familiar with the culture and the language barrier and all that they have to go through struggle. I mean, from your young age, I'm sure there was some difficulties leaving Capital Park. The people that were there, the African American, they did not want you guys. I mean, the people that actually were relocated there, meaning that. So you had to see some, challenges on upfront. So knowing that, having a fully understanding of what that's like, how can we bridge the parents and the 0.5 ones?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
I'm a scholar, so I'm always going to answer questions in a scholarly manner, the way I've been trained. But I'll say that the way I see this generational gap was really based on a brief research study I did. So at some point I noticed that young Somalis, high school students, all over America during the murder of George Floyd, BLM, were lead organizers in BLM movements and protests. And people were saying, we'd never seen sort of young Somalis in particular be that politicized around blackness and their black identity. And interviewing those young people, to answer your question, when they were asked, how did you become involved in activism? They all said their parents and grandparents. And so the reason why the generational conversation is important is that older Somalis have something to teach to young Somalis, that resisting oppression has been a fundamental part of Somali identity, going as far back as the British colonial incursions into Somalia. And so for me, many of these folks said that they watched their grandparents organizing against Italian colonialship in Somalia, the Somali Youth League, which was the organization that fought for Somali independence, the first political party. And so it is this what I call cultural knowledge between the older and younger generation that can give them tools for how to survive, how to resist, but also have a sense of their identity, a Somali identity that isn't about terrorists, pirates, warlords, right? It's an identity of poetry. It's an identity of resistance to imperialism and colonialism. And so I think that bridging the gap between the two is very critical. And the younger Somalis, what they can teach to older Somalis is understanding the complexities of life in America, right? That you don't have the option to not be black, to understand the histories of anti-blackness in this country, but to also understand if Somalis want to stay here and build a life here, what are some strategies and things that we can do? So I think having more forums and workshops and events for intercultural, intergenerational dialogue is really important, because as the older generation will eventually die out, the powerful thing about Somalis, and I don't want to go too much in Somali pride, is we have a long oral history, that Somalis retain their history going back generations, right? Knowing your father's lineage, their stories.
But that's the tribal side of it.
That is
right.
The tribal,
yeah.
But much of the, so there's two types of history. There's structural, government, political level history, and there's personal and individual history. These are really important.
Absolutely.
And I think that it's important to, outside of the tribal identity, to document the histories of families, what they experienced and got to, so that new generations can have access to that history,
yeah.
and be aware of where they came from outside of textbooks, school books, or government documents that could be corrupt, right, or create false
bias. Yeah. I mean, I oftentimes I hear we are like in an oral society. Why are we having a hard time changing that?
I think that,
I mean, are you frustrated as I am with that question? I mean, because I feel like this could easily be changed, or this could easily be kind of sort of having a momentum where, hey, this old generation that got us into this mess, the best you can do, at least talk about, let some of that be documented.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, and it's difficult. I mean, I try to reach out a bunch of folks to having a conversation about that specifically. No, I don't want to get into trouble. Who are you going to get in trouble with?
Yeah.
Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's like, again, this is the Civil War, side effect, that there's a whole generation that's going to grow up that most likely, unless scholars like you or people like interest like you that wanted to do a higher education to seek that information, other than that, it's just not going to be available to average Joe. That if they in the event that they decided, okay, well, at least I want to look up some Somali history. Where do I go to find it? And there's nothing. And all these, there is, and I get a chance to visit. I went to Minneapolis. This was like years back. Somali museums, and one of the things that I see there is a childhood stories, but you don't get to see the real stories about how the Civil War started, even though that we are, like we're knowledgeable enough how it got started. But it's not in a documentation where others can read. You see, outsider will come in, we'll talk to a few people, and they will write their perspective of it. But you don't get to see like somebody who lived through. Right.
I think you're asking a very complicated question about history, and I think it's it's two things. One thing is, and this is why I got into academia, is much of the history about Somali people, the scholarship about the war, are written by non-Somalis, right, who didn't live through that experience. And this is what's called in academia experiential knowledge, that argues that learning about something through books is not enough, that people's lived experiences is a form of knowledge that is important, right? And this is what they call decolonial knowledge, right? And so for Somali people, I think that we need both the oral and the written history. So the oral history, Somali has a long oral history, right? And sometimes it's critiqued for that, that there needs to have been more written text, right? And I think that we're actually living in an era today where the oral narratives might actually reach a much wider audience than written text, with the internet, with YouTube, with social media. The question is, will that information be scholarly or rigorous, or people making sort of false claims? But as a scholar, I do argue that we need to document our histories, our stories, our perspectives. We need more Somali scholars, more Somali educators that can teach not only the older generation, but also the younger generation about their history, about the war, what caused the war, right? Was it simply tribal conflict? And in my book, I argue that is a part of it, but I also argue the war was partly influenced by U.S. imperialism in Somalia. It was partly influenced by the colonial legacies of the British, the French, and the Italians in destabilizing Somali politics, right? And you don't get that narrative at all, but those historical documents exist, right? The U.S. Under Ronald Reagan, for example, gave close to $600 million of military equipment and funds to Syed Barre. He even visited the White House. So the U.S. did not want Somalia to be a stable, independent democracy. They wanted, and so this narrative of the war doesn't exist for younger people. So I do think, despite us being an oral society, we need more written text, and we need more written text by people who lived through it and who've experienced it, right? And this is part of the work that I'm trying to do. Is, so to all your listeners, shout out. We have a PhD program in my department in African American Studies. I'm on the Graduate Studies Committee. You know, I mentor students. So any Somalis that want to go to a PhD, learn this history, I can link them to a network of Somali scholars, because the argument made against us is that we are oral people. We are not scholars. White people have to write our story for us, right? And then, you know, and
it's frustrating.
It is.
It is frustrating. So how do we encourage our most educators in Somalis that are old enough to live through the war, that are educated enough to get a pen and a piece of paper and write that information? How do we push that?
You know, that is a question I can't necessarily answer, right? In terms of people, what I can answer is why it's important to do that. Right. And so the war, so the Somali people aren't defined by the war, but it created such a major rift and destruction of our community and society that it is important to write about it and to write about these experiences so that history doesn't repeat itself again. So that tribalism and tribal conflict doesn't become the defining feature of Somali stories and Somali life. And I think that it becomes even more important. For the first time, we have a generation of Somalis who never lived through the war, who never experienced the war, and that this story, which is the war created, in essence, the Somali diaspora.
It did.
Before the war, there were Somalis that lived abroad, but it was very minimal. It created this massive diaspora and completely spread our people throughout the world. And that whether you're Somali in Dubai, South Africa, United States, Canada, London, what do you have in common? You have in common as a community that was ruptured by this war. You have in common the desire to have a collective sense of self. What is this sense of what unites us? If you, at some point, you'll have a room of Australian Somalis, French Somalis, and Arab Somalis speaking Arabic, and nobody can speak with each other, right? So the importance of the language as well as a way of sustaining a collective identity, but also I think the stories of the war aren't just stories that need to be told to document history, but it also, I listened to my parents' war story, and it was extremely inspiring to see how millions of people survived impossible odds, the strength, the ingenuity that it took to survive that, and the sacrifices that it took for the older generation really can inspire younger Somalis to do better, to do more, right? Because our parents made a tremendous sacrifice to bring us to America for us to have these opportunities, right? If I had lived in Kenya, as you might well know, I would have never been a professor today. The opportunities are not available for Somalis in Kenya, the resources, and I think for those of us that are here, we have to take seriously the sacrifices the old generation so that we can do more, right? And I think that many young Somalis don't even know. All they know is poverty, growing up in the inner city, struggles with a family defined by mental health trauma, PTSD that's passed down generationally, and so just being Somali becomes, in some sense, a negative thing, right? A sense of
Absolutely.
of something you want to separate yourself. But I want to show the flip side, that the mental health trauma is important and real, but also the strength and resilience of that community is also incredibly powerful, right? The Somali BBC, that Somalis have relationships with people throughout the world and their families, right? And have still maintained a collective sense of self, right? To be Somali is to be, the Somali culture is completely antagonistic to American individualism, right? To be Somali is to be part of a group, to be part of a collective, and not only invested in your own self-interest. And I think that is what's going to sustain Somalis in the future. But older generations have to tell these stories for young people to know.
Right? It will come down to that, really, because a lot of kids that who grew up here, they don't have much of a story, and the only thing that they know is just bits and pieces,
right? Exactly.
But not necessarily the actually truth on how things were and how the actually the parents do experience that. So now, in when is that book going to come out?
So I do have a solution to your answer. I think the solution is, and we're trying to do this at OSU to some extent, is Somali language courses, Somali history courses that are accessible to the general population, right? How many young Somalis aged between,
let me ask you this,
know about Somali history?
For OSU and my days in college, certain languages were required as your part of your BS.
Right.
Is Somali part of generally speaking, required for certain?
It's not required.
Okay.
I think undergrads do have a language requirement.
Okay.
It's a language course you can take.
And it will be counted towards your general
it will be counted
education.
towards your language requirement and your general education. So
Gotcha.
we have Somali languages at the university, taught by Somali instructors, one of the few universities to have that. And so the goal is to sort of advertise that. What I'm trying to develop, since I'm not a language expert, is Somali history courses. And the goal is to make these courses online. We have an online African American Studies BA program, so that people in the community can enroll in these courses, right? And learn this information and really make that accessible to younger generations of Somali and encourage them. Because the people that don't know their history don't know who they are. It's really essential.
And I think it's a very important to have, how the Civil War came about and kind of sort of going to go through, because I'll share a quick story with you. I left by plane, and straight came to Mombasa. Somebody there who was with us, part of extended family, who was at the airport that day that we're about to leave it, didn't get that opportunity. But the resilience and the focus and the desire to leave, that person, give or take about a 5 month, met us on Mombasa. So each person have a unique story about to share that. And I think it will be interesting to have like a scholar like you to actually bring those books to life. And I think you have that opportunity, and hopefully you'll share that with the generation coming up. So you mentioned something about Reagan that giving aid to Siad Barre back then, right? So in the United States, they did not want Somali to go through the Civil War, but at the same time, oftentimes that I hear from where I am right now, that there's outsiders that really don't want Somali to kind of sort of stand with their 2 feet. And there's a lot of aid that's going to it, but we're up to 30 years now. How often, how many more years are we going to say that we need aid every year? So it became like kind of sort of the thing. The budget, to take that into consideration. So, what are your views that outsiders are constantly interfering Somalia to do better?
Yeah, I mean, this is why Somali history is important, right? I always tell people, Somalia is a country the size of Texas. It's a very small country, right? And so, what has always been interesting is why has there been so much international attention and investment in Somalia as far back as the British colonial powers. And that's because of Somalia, where it's located on the Indian Ocean. Strategically, right? You have trade between the Middle East, North Africa, East Africa, and the U.S. So my book is about how the U.S. first became involved in Somalia. And the U.S. first became involved in Somalia, but in the 1950s. Prior to Somalia being independent, there were American politicians, right, where they wanted to be involved in access to Somalia before Somalia gained independence. So I know this through having access to colonial documents, Italian colonial archival documents about the U.S. in particular wanting post-independence to have access to Somalia, right? And what they wanted Somalia for was they wanted to build military bases in Somalia so that they could extend U.S. military force throughout North and East Africa. And they succeeded doing that in terms of the large military base in Djibouti, and a few of them in Somalia themselves. But they had those plans as early as the 1950s. So the idea that the U.S. is an innocent benefactor that came to save Somalia in 1991, Operation Restore Hope, is not true. They've always been deeply invested, and like many countries, the French, the Italians, an unstable Somalia is beneficial to them. They can maintain economic relations, political relations, they have access to its resources, but a stable Somalia that says, get out of our country, if you want our resources, you have to negotiate with us, is a threat, right? Particularly in the current global war on terror, right?
Speaking of resource, we recently invited Turkey to come and take a look at it, those gas opportunities, right? Oil and gas. And what do you think of that?
I'm always suspicious of any, in particular, foreign inversion, because it's not a story of Somalia. It's a story of Africa, right? A continent that was raped of its resources for hundreds of years, but a continent that continues to still be exploited, right? So how is Africa the most resource-rich continent in the world, yet the poorest? Because the resources aren't going back to those people, right? So any country, China is sort of a new empire that's interested in Africa. You always have to question, are they there to exploit the resources, and are the politicians running the Somali government going to have enough dignity and honor to resist and ensure that the resources and the infrastructure go back to building the country, right? And so I'm always suspicious, because most countries, they want to sort of extract and gain without really putting back into the country in terms of roads, schools, hospitals, right? Somalia, when the British and Italians were colonizing it, they weren't interested in infrastructure. They weren't interested in building. They were interested in exporting of resources, access to the coast, right? They developed the city capital, Mogadishu, and the coast, but they didn't develop the rural areas, right? And Somalis are, for the most part, nomads and camel herders, right? And so you see a huge division, even colonial, in terms of where the resources are. And then the Somali government that came to power in 1960 was completely unable to expend their power beyond the city-states. But yeah, I'm as a scholar who sort of studied Somali history going back, as early as the early 1800s and on, I'm always suspicious, right? And I think every Somali should be suspicious of foreign incursions, into the country, because they rarely led to positive results for the people.
Absolutely, I agree with you 100%. They had to be interested of something. It just depends on that interest. It's not being discussed on out loud, so people, the regular people, can really understand. So at least we understand that there's no such a thing like free lunch. There has to be some sort of taking, giving away. So, but it just, the question begs for, like, how much you're going to take, right? And so that is yet to be discussed. But a lot of people argue that Turkey has been our ally for such a long time ago. They stood by you when nobody else would stand by you, and all that stuff. But I hope it will end up being a good positive. And I have nothing, no doubt about that. But it just only time will tell. Now, what is the U.S. relation to Somalia right now?
The U.S., America's relationship to Somalia is defined by the war on terror, right? So 1990s, their relationship with Somalia, so it's what the U.S. says versus what they're actually doing. So in Operation Restore Hope, the U.S. says they're there to bring aid to starving Somalis during the war. That was the official language. But what they were really there for was to make sure that whoever came to power after Aidid would be malleable and have U.S. interest in mind, right? And they particularly didn't want certain leaders to I'm blanking on the name. Mohammed Farah Aidid. They didn't want Aidid
and Ali Mahdi.
Yeah, to come to power, and the operation was really an assassination attempt on his life, right?
Okay.
So the beginning, it was humanitarianism. That's what they said they were there for. Here, they're no longer interested in that. What they want is to defeat terrorism and defeat Al-Qaeda, and they're arguing that with Al-Shabaab, Somalia is the premier site of terrorism, and that is the justification for U.S. military presence, right? So U.S. imperialism, right, which is how a country dominates other countries economically and politically through military force, always has to have something to legitimize it. And today, their presence in Somalia is legitimized by the war on terror. We are here to fight terrorism, right?
Yeah.
But what they're ultimately there for is to extend their military control all over North, with AFRICOM, North Africa, East Africa, and that's the current relationship with Somalia today is still defined by the war on terror and what some scholars call historical amnesia, which means they forgot what they did in Somalia, right? They act like they're new people, and the world's global police is what America is today in Somalia.
In your book, did you touch on the history that happened, civil war within civil war, I call it, when the Aidid and Ali Mahdi, those are two different tribes, right? They were fighting against one another. Did you touch on that on your book? Did you look into that a little bit?
No.
Okay.
I didn't, because my book was primarily about U.S. imperialism in Somalia, its history, and the way it's ongoing to this day, and the way it impacts not only Somalia but Somali people in America, right? So I said the war on terror is a war at home and abroad. So at home in the United States, it's about surveilling Somali Americans. In Somalia, it is about drone strikes and drone assaults. In the United States, it's about sending FBI agents to Somali masjids and so on and so forth. So for me, I was interested in is how is U.S. imperialism continuing to impact Somali life in America and in Somalia, right? Because that history and that ongoing structure is really rarely talked about in scholarship and in academia, right? People talk about the Somali Civil War as just a tribal conflict that resulted in the ousting of the dictator. But during the height of the war, with Operation Restore Hope, at some point you had more than 20 different countries and their militaries in Somalia. So I always say, is it a civil war if there's 20 to 30 different countries and their militaries? It's a transnational war. It's a global war, right? And so for me, this is so there's other scholars. There's Clan Cleansing, which is a book that came out a few years ago that talks about that deals with the history of tribal conflict. My perspective on that, I won't spend too much time, is I argue that the Somali tribal system as it is was actually created by both the British and Italians as a divide and conquer strategy, and that they were actually instilling tribal animosity, particularly the Italian government. They would assassinate a leader of one tribe, blame it on the other, give resources. So for them, if Somalis were in tribal conflict, it benefited the colonial powers. It was easier to rule them. After they left, the legacy they created continued, right? And I think it's the closest country to that is Rwanda, with the Rwandan genocide and the Hutu and Tutsi identity being colonial fabrications, right? They were, in some ways, Somali tribal identity existed, but the British have what's called customary laws. So in order for you as a Somali person to get in resources from the British colonial government, you had to negotiate through your tribal leader. And the Somali tribal system didn't have a single unified leader. It was a democratic choice amongst the elders. So they solidified power in certain individuals and created a leadership style that wasn't indigenous to Somalia and Somali people. And in some ways, localized power amongst individuals. So I won't get into the history of that too much, but my book doesn't really address that. It's really about U.S. imperialism.
I want to make one point on that Rwanda. It saddens me that Rwanda war was in '94. And if you look at that country where it is now, it tells you how leadership is very important, right? Somebody that who is not I want it all, rather than somebody that what we want all. Okay, so one of the things that I don't know if I read somebody, I don't know if I had some discussion about it with somebody, said that when Paul Kagame took in place, it was his people that got short end of the stick. And he said that we're not taking revenge.
Right.
We are reconciling and moving on as a nation. And I think if Somalia were to learn anything about Rwanda, is just how important it is to have leadership. And I think we lack leadership in so many levels, it's not even funny. And that's all there is to it. So we're not going to spend too much time on that. So if you guys listening out there, we need a better leadership. What we had, what we have, and hopefully not what we're going to have in the coming years or so. So you talked about a little bit about the drones, right? I mean, that's just the one way a country that who's have a power to against another country that can kind of sort of maintain their power over them. Literally, you know, that drone is over you. And what do you think about the Somalis, that it's almost like a gateway of interest to the country for outside folks, outside countries, people that are just to give them the intelligence to have, like, for example, that operation, what do you call that?
Operation Restore Hope.
Operation Restore Hope, right?
Military.
So now, in order for them to, even get in, they have to have like some sort of an intelligence on where to go to begin with, right? I remember, and there's this famous video that is in YouTube. You can find it. As the soldiers are coming in, they have flyers to pass around, and they give it to kids. And one gentleman just says, "Throw them out." We don't want that. So, is your book or is your research touching on the folks that kind of sort of help?
The Somalis that help? Yeah, no, I think it's a very important topic that you met up. So even during the U.S. military operation, right, you had Somali informants. So there's a famous book that the movie Black Hawk Down is based off of, which is called the book Black Hawk Down. And so he talks about how there were Somali informants that worked for the U.S. military that told them where locations and bases were, where people were, where intel were, right? And you have this story of Somalis that are selling out their own people as early as the colonial history, right? The Italians and British aren't able to rule without. And I think that in my book, the way I do talk about that is 9/11 in the United States, of how the FBI, and partly through my interviews, I did ethnography, tried to hire Somali informants to surveil their own community for the project of sort of counterterrorism, right? So they would offer to pay you a tremendous amount of money. And one of my interviews, the FBI informants were trying to recruit people as young as 10 years old, right? Which is both unethical, right, and just morally bankrupt. But you always, while there is sort of external oppression, you have also people in the community that are sustaining the ability for oppressors and foreign powers to sort of maintain control. Because my book is about U.S. imperialism, I don't necessarily address sort of the Somalis that were involved during operation. My book is looking at how did Somali Americans get here, right? It's a critique of American immigration, right? And I always tell my students this analogy, and it's a simplistic analogy, right? But it serves a purpose. Americans say, you are lucky to come here. We accepted you as refugees. We are doing you a favor. And I always use this analogy of what happened to Somalia. Imagine someone comes to your house. They burn down your house. You have to flee your house. You go to their house because you have nowhere to go, right? And they say, you are lucky we are accepting you. And what you say back to them is, our house wouldn't have burned down if it wasn't for you. So in my book, it ultimately argues America and Americans have a moral obligation to accept Somalis because they are partly responsible for what happened, for the destabilization of the government, for the ongoing sort of war on terror in Somalia that's causing devastation. And the U.S., so basically what I say is U.S. imperialism in some ways produced the Somali American population, right? Just that same way that they destabilized governments in Latin America.
Yeah.
And they say, now we don't want you here, right? But you created these colonial
Yes.
conditions. So that is what my book is really arguing in some ways. And it begins with the war. And then the second chapter is about the camps, right? The third chapter is when Somalis, I look at San Diego, first came to San Diego, and then the last chapter is the war on terror. And I say, if you look at this story of flight, of migration, of resettlement, it is a story of U.S. imperialism, right? That it is a story of a community that both was oppressed by U.S. imperialism, but still found ways to resist and organize. So part of my last chapter, I talk about, third chapter, police violence that Somalis experience, right? So the San Diego Police Department has a unit of counterterrorism, and that entire police unit, they created a memo called From a Three-Legged Horse, was about how to surveil the Somali community, how do we arrest the Somali community, how do we send informants into masjids, right? And for the first time, police, which don't deal with global stuff, are actually involved in counterterrorism, and they're working with the FBI, they're working with the U.S. military in Camp Pendleton. And so for me, I'm saying my book argues is, if you talk to Somalis, you will understand the relationship between the military and the police, the relationship between the global war on terror and the war on drugs and U.S. imperialism. So my book is fundamentally, in addition to government documents, is based off of interviewing close to 80 Somalis, oral histories of people during the war, but also interviews of young Somalis about their experiences with police violence. But also, as recently as last year, a young Somali child, I think about 3 months, was killed by a drone strike. The U.S. issued no apology.
Where?
It was in Mogadishu, I think, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
But that article, I can send these links everywhere.
Yeah.
So that article was reported by an investigative journalist, right,
Okay.
who was able to get these government documents. And sometimes when the U.S. drone strikes kill Somali civilians, they'll offer some money to the families, right? But I argue that Somali life is so devalued and dehumanized that oftentimes the U.S. military barely issues an apology or any restitution to these families, right? And these are civilians, right?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of how I look at state violence against Somali people, but the way Somalis have also resisted and organized politically against that state violence.
So, and these are mainly in California, right? Are the Somalis experiencing, how they're dealing with that situation where they feel like, or how are they being picked on comparing to other minority groups that are a similar situation?
Yeah, so part of my project, even though I'm from Columbus, is San Diego Somali community has very specific circumstances that might not exist for Somalis, but also very similar. So San Diego is at the border of the U.S.-Mexico border, right? So you have what's called the Joint Terrorism Task Force, also linked with Homeland Security and Border Patrol. So they're deporting Somalis, right? They're policing Somalis, right? You have the U.S. military based in Camp Pendleton training police officers about counterterrorism and specifically targeting the Somali community. So that Somali community, as a result of that, has organized in as early as 2020, but even earlier than that, resistance to that, right? Forming BLM, organizing, so all these different Somali organizations, youth-led, came about to challenge the specificity of San Diego's counterterrorism projects that links, and for me, I will say it was dizzying to see all the you have the police, Border Patrol, military, FBI, CIA, all working together. And this is not hidden, right? This is on the Joint Terrorism Task Force website, saying that the Somali community is a potential homegrown terrorist threat, right? So I'm looking at FBI documents, declassified documents, and much of the information is secret. So part of how I learned is interviewing people, right, and seeing white FBI agents infiltrate masjids, right? Surveillance taps on people's homes, right? So it's also a story about the war on terror and how Somalis became targets of that. And this is why the book is titled Black Muslim Refugee, right? That Somalis live at the intersection of anti-black racism and Islamophobia in the post 9/11 context, right? And this is why being black and Muslim have become sort of foundational identities to resist that, right?
Interesting stories.
Yeah.
Interesting articles that you know, or I should say, interesting work. To some of the work that you're going to do.
I mean, I will say one thing, and we did cover a lot, but you know, the thing that I think is really important is, as I mentioned earlier, is something I'm really passionate about, which is mentoring the younger generation of Somalis, right? Particularly being from Columbus, seeing the struggles, particularly with opioid addictions, mental health issues.
Yep.
And so for me, I'm really invested in like my privileged position as a university professor, right? Mentoring young Somalis, helping Somalis through the PhD program, creating initiatives and programs in my department, because I believe that, for example, I'm the first Somali person, if I know, to ever publish with University of California Press, right?
Okay.
Every book that I had read as a young adult, I devoured anything written about Somali people, right? And it was always non-Somalis. And I think it's important for us to have that. We have Somali doctors, we have Somali engineers, we also need Somali scholars.
Yeah.
And we're in desperate need of that. And so for me, that's one thing, if any young Somali listeners, that, you know, I came from Capitol Park, I came from Columbus, and I never thought Ohio State would be a possibility. Now I'm professor. This route is available to people, that you can do this, and that we have enough young Somalis who are educated, who have the resources. So anybody that is interested, you know, my information is at the university website, Department of African American Studies. Send me an email, hit me up. I'm always available to mentor at the undergraduate, master's, PhD level. So my goal is to help build the next generation of Somali scholars.
No, I think what you're doing is excellent. Have you get in touch with SSA? I think it's called Somali Student Association or something.
Yes,
Okay.
I've been to some of their shows.
Okay.
I have been in touch with them, and I think that my goal is to be faculty advisor at OSU there. Now that we have 2 other Somali faculty, it's not just up to me.
Yeah.
We can hire more people. We can develop curriculum there. I'm developing a Somali history course at OSU that will be available in the future. But, you know, I'm still very new faculty, and as you might be aware, the goal, at least faculty, is to get tenure.
Yeah.
So what I'm waiting
tenure,
for is getting tenure. Once I'm established, I can really do the community work at the university level that I'm really passionate about.
Okay. No, I think what you're doing is excellent. And just a quick message to anybody that's listening, especially if you're in crossroad or in the education side of it, you know, understanding or maybe needing to somebody to kind of sort of show you the ropes and kind of give you advice on high level, on a deep level. And Dr. Abu-Maye, I think I will link in his contact information through the on the link on this episode. You can Google him up, and I think you should be able to find him at OSU. You know, like he said, hit him up, give him a call, drop him on the line, and you know, and I think the avenue is kind of sort of possible, right? Yeah.
And one final shout out.
Yeah.
So my book is coming out June 3rd, available to pre-order on Target, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. It's titled Black Muslim Refugee, Militarism, Policing, and Somali American Resistance to State Violence. So it drops June 3rd. Definitely cop it if you get a chance, read through it.
June 1st of next year.
June 3rd of 2025. It's coming out June 3rd, 2025. But it's already available for pre-order on all these different
if you have that
websites.
link, we'll just, you know, include it there.
Yeah,
so
I'll
if
send you the
yes,
link.
do that. Is it going to be available by audio too or no?
It's available as a Kindle book,
Okay.
a hardcover. I don't think it's available as an audio book
Okay.
yet, but I can definitely suggest that to the press.
Yeah, you should. A lot of people just oftentimes they like to do on multiple things, and audible.com and
Right.
available, and I think it's easy to, while you're doing your office work, you can just listen to and pop up and gain out of that. If you could give any advice, you already offered your help, but if you could give an advice to somebody that who may not reach out to you, maybe just listening, or maybe not in the Columbus, Ohio area, what advice would you give them? And somebody that was at a crossroad, looking to take the same avenue that you take, get into higher education.
I mean, the advice I would give, and this might sound too philosophical, is knowledge is power, right? The more that you can educate yourself and take your education seriously, right, is that we, as a younger generation in America, right, have the potential to transform our whole community, right, to build a better future in which our lives are not defined by Section 8 housing, police violence, and war on terror. So I would say take schooling seriously, take education, find mentors in higher education that can work with you, that can help you, and take your studies seriously, right? It might seem, education is something that pays off later, right? So you might be in school. I was in school for 10 years, got 2 masters and a PhD before I could be here. I didn't see immediate results, but that the hard work will pay off, and that we as Somalis have an obligation to our community, and that education in America, despite all the inequities, it is one of the few pathways for upward mobility. And so I would say never give up, and definitely take your education seriously and pursue them. And especially for young Somalis, avoid the distraction, avoid the drugs, avoid the naysayers, and just focus on your books and schools, and surround yourself with people who are on the same path as you, right? I've had to drop a lot of friends who, some of them are in jail now, right? But I just, I couldn't go down that path, right? And I surrounded myself with others who are sort of college bound, and we have enough young Somalis. Being at OSU is so impressive. How many young Somalis are there getting their education in ways that you wouldn't have seen this 10 years ago?
I agree. You are the sum of the 5 people that you hang out. So make sure that the people that you hang out are the people that you want to go in the long run places with. And I want to say thank you so much for taking the time. And I'm really looking at it and a dream come true. Person that is sitting in front of me, from the DOP to all the way to a professor at OSU. At the Ohio State University. That is available to anybody if you're willing to put the work in. I want to say thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
We'll leave it at that.
Thank you.